Chahat Verma, moderator for the session, and I'm deeply honored to have Mr. Nakul Sachdeva and Mr. Manu Kulkarni as our esteemed speakers. Mr. Nakul Sachdeva is a partner, dispute resolution at L&L Partners. Mr. Sachdeva graduated from Indian Law Society Law College, Pune University, and began his career in litigation in the chambers of Mr. Amarjeet Singh Chandok, the then Additional Solicitor General of India. He subsequently joined the City Civil Courts team of Karanjawala and Company in the year 2009. He then in 2018 joined L&L Partners as partner designate and was elevated to a partner in November 2019. Since joining L&L Partners, Mr. Sachdeva has been extensively and actively involved in significant matters relating to the Arbitration Act as well as the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and regularly appears before NCLTs, NCLAT, and the Honorable Supreme Court. Given his diverse and rich litigation experience spanning well over a decade and dealing with multitude of laws, Mr. Sachdeva brings to the table his comprehensive set of skills and insightful appreciation of complex legal issues. The same are truly valued by the clients and make him and the firm a voice for public undertakings and other public and private sector undertakings for pursuing litigation and obtaining opinion, particularly in the fields of arbitration, civil litigation, and insolvency resolution. Welcome, Nakul sir. We are honored to have you here today.
Thank you, Chahat.
Our next speaker is Mr. Manu Kulkarni, partner, head of dispute resolution with Puvaya and Company. Mr. Kulkarni is a third-generation lawyer. Mr. Manu holds a BA, BL honors degree from the Nalsa University of Law, Hyderabad, and he was a gold medalist. Previously having worked as a partner in common law chambers and as an associate in Amarchand Mangaldas, Mumbai, cemented Mr. Manu's core expertise in commercial litigation and arbitration. He has extensive experience in advising clients across jurisdictions in all aspects of dispute resolution. Mr. Manu regularly appears before multiple judicial and quasi-judicial fora in Bangalore, including the Karnataka High Court, City Civil Courts, NCLT, DRT, State and District Consumer Disputes Redressal Commission, and arbitral tribunals. Mr. Manu briefs and interacts with some of the most renowned senior counsels practicing before the Supreme Court of India, the Karnataka High Court, and multiple other high courts and tribunals in the country. Welcome, Manu sir. We are honored to have you here today.
Thank you, Chahat. Thank you very much.
So today's legit class is on Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code and Arbitration and Conciliation Act, which one prevails. This class is organized by Legit Quest, which is an artificial intelligence-based legal research product. It is a state-of-the-art legal research platform for conducting legal research and is very well known for the introduction of the world's only one-click insight system called the iDraft Case Analytics. In short, the iDraft feature powered by artificial intelligence takes out the issue, facts, arguments, reasoning, and decision of a case law. Legit Quest has recently started with Legit App, latest news, interviews, and columns, and serves the stakeholders of judiciary. So to begin, today's session will be for 45 minutes, followed by Q&A. I would request all our participants to be mute and with video throughout the call. And all the questions to the speakers can be written in the chat box, which we will be taking in the end if the time permits. I will now hand over it to Nakul sir now. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Chahat. Thank you so much. A very good evening to all the participants who are here and to the organizers for organizing this wonderful meet and webinar. The topic, as Chahat has said, deals with the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, as well as the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and which out of the two would prevail. First things first, for a particular act to prevail over another, there needs to be a conflict between two acts or two laws. If there is no conflict as such, then the question becomes redundant because it need not be answered, for the sake that if there is no conflict, then there is no question of a certain law prevailing over the other. So we need to first understand that what are the scenarios in which there can be a conflict between the IBC and the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, and then come to an analysis that if there is a conflict, what happens in that scenario. So with this thought process in mind, first let us just discuss that what is the Arbitration and Conciliation Act and what is the IBC. what are the basic objectives of these acts and why have these acts actually been enacted. So starting off with the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, I suppose all of us must be aware that the Arbitration and Conciliation Act primarily is a dispute resolution mechanism whereby it is an alternative to the jurisdiction of the civil court for certain matters to which the parties have specifically agreed to be referred to for arbitration. The IBC, in distinction to the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, is actually not a dispute resolution mechanism. The IBC is a very different law. Uh, the IBC is a law which can't be used for recovery. It can't be used for the resolution of a dispute. It is generally used for the resolution of a scenario wherein a debt is due to a certain party and the person from whom such debt is due is unable to pay that debt. So what happens in that scenario? Essentially, the IBC is premised on a basis of inability to pay and not on the basis of a dispute on account of which no payment is being made. So they typically operate in very different spheres, wherein the arbitration operates in a sphere wherein there is a dispute on account of which payment is not being made, whereas the IBC operates in a sphere wherein there is some inability on account of which payment is not being made, and that inability is not a dispute. It is a pure inability. Now, the IBC can broadly be broken down into 3 chapters. What are those chapters? The chapters are, the first part of the IBC is initiation proceedings. When a proceedings under the IBC are initiated. The second chapter under the IBC is that when the proceedings, and by proceedings I mean the CIRP, the Corporate Insolvency Resolution Proceedings, which happens once the petition is admitted, those are going on. And the third stage is after the CIRP ends, either a resolution applicant takes over the company or the company goes into liquidation. Now we have to see that what is the scope and ambit or chances of a conflict which under the Arbitration Act can take place in each of these 3 stages of a proceedings under the IBC. So we first start off that what is the importance of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act or a dispute raised under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act vis-a-vis stage 1 of IBC. Stage 1, when I say stage 1, entails initiation of an insolvency proceeding. So primarily section 7, section 9 and section 10 of the IBC. Section 7 talks about the fact that how a petition filed by a financial creditor under the IBC will be dealt with and admitted. Section 9 talks about how a petition by an operational creditor filed under the IBC will be dealt with. And Section 10 deals with initiation of the CIRP process by the corporate debtor itself. Now, Section 7 is very interesting because primarily the prerequisites of Section 7 are only 2 prerequisites to a Section 7. The first prerequisite is that the party who's filed a Section 7 has to fall within. Am I audible now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes. I was talking about Section 7 of the IBC, which falls in the chapter of initiation of an insolvency proceedings. Chahat, can you help me? Where was I when I got muted? Was I here?
So just like you've just joined, it's fine. You were just muted for like a second.
Okay, that's fine. So coming back to Section 7, Section 7, the essential prerequisites of Section 7 are that firstly, it has to be filed by a financial creditor. Now, who is a financial creditor is defined under the IBC. So a person filing under Section 7 has to fulfill the prerequisites of being a financial creditor, one. And second, that a default must have occurred. Now, the term default is specifically defined under the IBC. From the definition of default, you are led to the definition of debt. And from the definition of debt, you are led to the definition of a claim. And all these three terms are specifically defined in the IBC. Claim is defined in Section 3, subsection 6. Debt is defined in Section 3, subsection 11. And default is defined in Section 3, subsection 12. Now, what is the link in between these three definitions is that a claim is any right to a recovery, which whether crystallized, uncrystallized, reduced to a judgment, fixed, disputed, undisputed, legal, equitable, it is just a right to a payment. A claim becomes a debt only when the liability or obligation is crystallized. So till the time the right to a payment is uncrystallized, it is a claim. Once it becomes crystallized, it becomes a debt. And once that debt becomes due and not paid, it becomes a default. So with regard to Section 7, let's take a scenario wherein there is an arbitration which is pending, and this arbitration has been filed by a person who has given a loan to B with a specific date on which that loan had to be repaid, and that loan is not repaid. A first initiates an arbitration against B. In that arbitration, B takes the stand that by way of some adjustment, I have already paid you back the loan and there is no loan left today. During the pendency of this arbitration, A initiates an insolvency proceedings against B and files a petition under Section 7 of the IBC. Now, in this case scenario, if we actually see the letter of the law, if we read out Section 7, the adjudicating authority, which is the NCLT is not mandated under Section 7 to look at any dispute. So the pendency of an arbitration proceedings is not going to have any bearing on the Section 7 per se. But if you go back to the prerequisites route, if you go through the route of what are the prerequisites under Section 7, there has to be a default. For a default to occur, a default can only be of a debt and not of a claim. And the primary difference between a debt and a claim is that a debt is crystallized and a claim is not crystallized. So if there is an arbitration pending on whether an amount is crystallized or not in favor of a financial creditor, going by this route, it can always be argued that though the adjudicating authority is not to look at any dispute under a petition in under Section 7, however, because there is no default, as there is no debt due, because a claim has not been crystallized by way of a pending arbitration, the petition under Section 7 should not be admitted. Now, I just want to state one thing again, that here in this case scenario of Section 7, there is no conflict between the two laws. There is no conflict between the Arbitration and Conciliation Act and the IBC, but here I'm trying to put out a method wherein both have to go hand in hand, and how the proceedings pending in one have to be looked at while deciding the proceedings in the second. Now we come to Section 9. Section 9, initiation of an insolvency proceedings is done by an operational creditor. The prerequisites under Section 9 to a certain extent actually differ from that mentioned in Section 7. The primary prerequisites, there are many technical prerequisites also, which I'm not mentioning. I'm picking up the prerequisites which sort of deal with or overlap with the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. And these prerequisites are that firstly, a notice under Section 8 should have been sent, and sent by a person who is an operational creditor as per the definition of operational creditor as under the IBC, and no notice of dispute should have been received by the operational creditor within 10 days of sending the notice under Section 8. So Section 9 and Section 8, which talks about the notice for to be sent by an operational creditor, are the sections which essentially talk about the terminology dispute. Like I said, Section 7 nowhere mentions dispute, so you have to go by the route of by the definitions of default, debt, claim. Section 9 in contradistinction specifically uses the term existence of a dispute. Now, the term dispute is also defined in the IBC itself and includes pendency of an arbitration petition. So, in this regard, we have a case scenario that if a party claiming to be an operational creditor sends a notice to a debtor for initiation of insolvency proceedings under Section 9, and there is a pre-existing dispute between the parties which would entail pendency of an arbitration, then the Section 9 petition cannot be admitted. So again, the path is very clear. If there is an arbitration petition pending, then a Section 9 petition would not be maintainable. The definition which is given to a dispute under the IBC, which is Section 5, subsection 6, includes a suit or an arbitration proceedings relating to the existence of the amount of debt, the quality of goods or services, or the breach of a representation or warranty. Most importantly, this is not an exhaustive definition. This is an inclusive definition. And secondly, what is to also be seen is that when the legislature says includes a suit or arbitration proceedings, does the legislature take into account pendency of a Section 9, pendency of a Section 11, or is it only a substantive proceedings under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act which is contemplated by this definition? This is one question that needs to be looked at. And in my view, right from when a dispute arises in an arbitration, which we go back to Section 20, it is that point that the dispute has arisen, holds the fact whether a 11 is pending or a substantive arbitration proceedings is pending. So the notice whereby arbitration is invoked is the notice through which a dispute is communicated. In some cases, the dispute can be communicated prior to the invocation notice as well. And this can be done when one set of facts by party A are communicated to party B. As soon as party B refuses or refutes those set of facts is when the dispute arises. The dispute does not actually arise if you go ahead and file a Section 9, or you go ahead and file a Section 11, or the date on which your substantive arbitration proceedings start. The dispute actually predates when one set of facts on the basis of which a cause of action arises are disputed by party B is the date on which the dispute arises, and there can be an invocation subsequent to the arising of the dispute. Now, the next point which we need to consider is that whether Section 34, pendency of a 34 petition or pendency of a 37 petition, would also amount to pendency of a dispute for the sake of Section 9 of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. And on this point, the Supreme Court has given a categorical judgment, which is K. Kishan versus Vijay Nirman Company, in which the Honorable Supreme Court has clarified that, you see, section 34 as well as 37 is nothing but an extension of the initial arbitration proceedings, and by virtue of it being an extension of the initial arbitration proceedings, it is nothing but an extension of the dispute. So let's take a case scenario again, wherein A had given some services to B, and B had disputed the quality of those services and not paid A the money for those services. Now A files an arbitration against B, and eventually an award comes in favor of A. So the definition of claim is now converted into a debt, because what was an uncrystallized amount has now become a crystallized amount by way of the award. However, B files an appeal under section 30, a petition under section 34, assailing the award. Will A be able to initiate insolvency proceedings under section 9? The answer in terms of the Supreme Court judgment is no, because the section 34 will be taken as an extension of the arbitration proceedings, and in view thereof, a dispute would still be pending and a section 9 petition under the IBC would not be maintainable. This is again a circumstance in which what I'm suggesting is how the Arbitration Act as well as the IBC are read together. So till now, we've covered section 7, we've covered section 9. In my opinion, there is no overlap. They proceed simultaneously because they have different objectives. And because there is no overlap, till now the question of which act prevails does not come into consideration. So this finishes chapter 1 of the IBC vis-a-vis the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. And chapter 1, just to refresh everyone's memory, deals with initiation of an insolvency proceedings. Now we move on to chapter 2 of the IBC, which is what happens once an insolvency proceedings have been initiated. What is the effect of initiation of the CIRP process on Arbitration Act and arbitration proceedings? The first section which takes importance or precedence in this regard is section 14. Now section 14 talks about something of the IBC. I'm talking about section 14 of the IBC, which talks about something which is known as a moratorium. As soon as an insolvency petition is admitted, a moratorium is imposed by the adjudicator. As soon as an insolvency petition is admitted, a moratorium is imposed by the NCLT. A moratorium specifically is covered by section 14 of the IBC. And for our discussion today, what is necessary is 14 subsection 1, which states that as soon as an insolvency proceedings have been initiated, so the CIRP process has been initiated, the institution of suits or continuation of pending suits or proceedings against the corporate debtor, including execution of any judgment, decree or order in any court of law, tribunal, arbitration panel or other authority is barred. So as soon as an insolvency petition is admitted, as a result, an automatic order of moratorium is ought to be passed, and by virtue of this moratorium, no suit or any other proceeding, including execution proceedings, can be continued or initiated against the corporate debtor. Now, the language of section 14 subsection 1 by itself is very clear that it includes an arbitration against the corporate debtor. So an arbitration against the corporate debtor cannot continue. Execution of an award against the corporate debtor cannot happen. Again, section 14 subsection 1 is very clear. But let's take a case scenario in which an arbitration is pending against the corporate debtor, in which the corporate debtor has actually filed a counterclaim of a larger amount than what has been claimed against him. So the corporate person who's undergoing insolvency has filed a counterclaim in an arbitration petition, which is for 10 crores, in which arbitration petition, the claim is for 8 crores. So eventually, whenever that matter will be decided, if it's decided in the favor of the corporate debtor, then he will get 10 crores. So it is essentially not a proceedings which is only against him, but subject to what decision comes in the proceedings, it can be a proceedings which are beneficial for the corporate debtor, because he may end up getting money rather than paying something out of his own pocket. Now, why am I stating this particular example and stressing on the words beneficial, not prejudicial, end up paying more, or end up getting more money, is because these words actually define why section 14 subsection 1 exists in the IBC. The reason for section 14 subsection 1 to exist in the IBC is that it is in the sort of a breathing period which is given to a corporate debtor, so that the corpus of the corporate debtor, by corpus we mean the assets of the corporate debtor, are not in any manner diminished during the CIRP process. So the CIRP process have been made in a manner that once the CIRP is initiated, after that nothing should go out of the corporate debtor, but if anything has to be added to its assets to make it more valuable, then that additions can be made, but no subtractions can be made. With this view in mind, there are a few judgments in which a similar scenario has arisen, and one of the judgments is that of the NCLAT. There is another very famous and well-founded judgment of the Delhi High Court in this matter, which is titled Jyoti Structures, which deals with the fact that what happens when there is a counterclaim and a claim and a counterclaim pending. Will the moratorium apply to such cases or not? And the Delhi High Court has actually said that, any proceedings which are beneficial to the corporate debtor are not barred under section 14 subsection 1, and they should actually continue. There's no problem in them continuing. So keeping this in mind, by virtue of a counterclaim pending, that proceedings can continue, point number 1. Point number 2, what also the Delhi High Court has clarified is that, and the NCLAT as well has clarified that if, say, the award comes against the corporate debtor, then in that case, the award will not be executable in any case, because the execution is specifically barred under 14.1. So the corporate debtor is not hurt in any manner. So he can go ahead. If by any chance the counterclaim comes in his favor, he'll be more than happy. He can get it executed, get the money into the company. However, if he loses the counterclaim and loses the claim and is eventually liable to pay money, then nothing will go out from the company, because an execution of that claim or that award will not be possible in view of 14.1. Now, there is another very important aspect which flows from this, is that once the CIRP is initiated, the first step is that the moratorium is imposed. And then the CIRP proceeds. Now, when the CIRP proceeds, there are claims which can be filed by financial creditors, and there are claims that can be filed by operational creditors, and then there are claims that can be filed by other creditors. But for the sake of this discussion today, let us fix ourselves to claims that can be filed by operational creditors and claims that can be filed by financial creditors. Now, filing of a claim during the CIRP by a financial creditor is not the same as filing of a Section 7 petition, because a Section 7 petition specifically uses the term default, but a claim which is filed under Regulation 8 of the CIRP regulations by a financial creditor, there need not be any default. It needs to only go back to the definition of a claim. So for example, if today there was a financial creditor who was actually fighting in an arbitration against a corporate debtor, he couldn't, by virtue of the initial point that I had made of going through default debt claim, may not have been able to succeed against the corporate debtor in a Section 7 petition, but he can still file his claim as a financial creditor during the CIRP. And the same goes for an operational creditor. Although an arbitration is pending with regard to an operational creditor, so it is a dispute which is pending. So that operational creditor cannot file a Section 7. He specifically, Section 9. He specifically barred by the IBC to file a Section 9. However, he can still file his claim during the CIRP as an operational creditor by virtue of Regulation 7. So this is a very important aspect, that pendency of an arbitration with regard to any amount, although it may discourage people to file under the IBC for initiating insolvency, but once an insolvency has been initiated, these people who have pending arbitrations can still file their claims. And then these claims are thereafter dealt with in the resolution plan. And once dealt with in the resolution plan, they are paid out or not paid out in terms with whatever is specifically stated in the plan. So how the plan is post the third stage of the IBC. The first stage is CIRP. Stage number 2 is during the pendency of the CIRP proceedings. And stage number 3 is after conclusion of the CIRP proceedings, that is after a resolution plan has been approved. Once a resolution plan has been approved, in terms of whatever is stated in the resolution plan is the future fate of any arbitration that may be pending or that may have been initiated prior to the CIRP proceedings being initiated. So Manu, I am done with my first bit. I would request Manu to now take over from here.
Thank you, Nakul. I think it was a great bird's eye view of the places where the two statutes interact. Now, I begin by saying a big thank you to LegitQuest, to Karan, to Chahat and the entire team for making this possible. Now, even before I start, all of us know that we are in difficult times, and as a part of the judicial, as a part of the justice system, I must say that it is our judges and more importantly the court staff who have been facing, who in the face of the threat of COVID continue to frequent the courts and keep our system alive. So I'd like to begin with a word of thank you and a word of prayer for all of them, because relatively speaking, we are in the relative comfort of our homes or offices. Now coming to the subject, my friend Nakul has very beautifully indicated how, while there is no conflict, there are stages where, in some sense, the Arbitration Act gives way to the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, in the sense that an arbitration which has commenced will cease to continue, and if CIRP goes through, what the parties had agreed as a mode of resolution of dispute, which is arbitration, will come to an end, and a claim will have to be filed before the CIRP, before the IRP, and therefore the arbitration in that sense will stop. So therefore these are two instances really where arbitration gives way to Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and therefore while there is really no conflict, the chosen mode of the parties for resolving their disputes will no more be available because of the Bankruptcy Code. Now, since this has been spoken upon by Nakul, I'd like to look at a scenario where the Arbitration and Conciliation Act can possibly stand in the way of insolvency proceedings being conducted. And there has also been some amount of litigation surrounding this issue, which is making of applications under Section 8 of the Arbitration Act, which is the exactly opposite scenario where one of the parties to the dispute comes to the tribunal and says, please now refer the parties to arbitration. Therefore, please do not exercise any further jurisdiction in the matter Therefore, let this dispute be resolved under the provisions of the Arbitration Act and not, so to say, under the provisions of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So these applications have been filed. There are orders. I'll refer to them, but before I do that, if one has to step back and look at the nature of the proceedings, proceedings under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, as they say, are proceedings in rem, that is, proceedings where it is not just inter se between two parties, but proceedings that involve, for instance, all the debtors, all the creditors, all the shareholders of the entity concerned or the entity against who insolvency proceedings are initiated. So it will affect all those entities, although the person initiating the proceedings may be party to a private list or a private dispute. Therefore, these are the proceedings in that sense, therefore, are proceedings in rem. That is, they don't just apply or operate inter se between the parties. They apply to a large body of people. And of course, it is quite evident from the code that once an application gets admitted, thereafter, the manner in which all those people whose interests may be affected have to participate, the manner in which they will vote, the control that each groups of creditors have in respect of how, whether the company will be resolved and in what manner, all of that has been provided for by the code. Therefore, although at the initiation there are two parties, as one goes through various stages of the proceedings post-admission, it is not really inter-parties or between two parties anymore, but a plethora of people. So therefore, one can hardly dispute the fact that proceedings under the Insolvency Code are proceedings in rem. Now, the most classic judgment often referred to on this point is the decision in Booz Allen by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court refers to various categories of disputes that are not capable of settlement by arbitration, and among others calls out insolvency proceedings as a category of those proceedings which are not capable of settlement by arbitration. Of course, this was not the pointed question before the Supreme Court because this is a decision of 2011, and at that point in time the code wasn't in existence, and similar proceedings, if one can use that term, under the Companies Act were prevailing. So going back to what was the law during the Companies Act regime, in Sterlite Industries versus State of Haryana, the Supreme Court has taken, in a rather crisp 6-paragraph judgment, the Supreme Court has taken a clear and a categorical view that winding up proceedings are not proceedings initiated for the purpose of recovery of monies, whereas arbitration is always initiated for recovery of monies. So therefore, if a party wants to, that is if the defendant or the respondent wants to set up an arbitration provision and move an application under Section 8 of the Arbitration Act in response to a winding up action, Supreme Court says, sorry, that is not maintainable and rejects the application under Section 8. So that is under the winding up regime. The question, therefore, that falls for consideration is whether the same jurisprudence, of course not identical, but since the principles are somewhat similar, if not altogether the same, whether the same principles will apply if the company against whom proceedings are initiated under the IBC were to make an application under Section 8 of the Arbitration Act. That is, use the Arbitration Act to bring an end to proceedings under the Insolvency Code. This question came up before the NCLT at Mumbai, and the NCLT at Mumbai has taken a view that an application under Section 8 is maintainable and in fact proceeds to allow the application. Of course, all these decisions have been considered. Since the time really is short, what I will say is this: the premise on which the application comes to be made under Section 8 is not that the destination of both the proceedings is the same, but on the premise that the application filed under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code is not really a bona fide application for resolution, but is an application which is dressed up. Now this phrase, a dressed up application, is borrowed from jurisprudence surrounding operation and mismanagement, another set of proceedings under the Companies Act, which fall solely within the domain of the NCLT. So even there, under the jurisprudence under Section 8 of the Arbitration Act, the law has, as laid down today by some of the honorable high courts, is that an application which is really not in the nature of an application for operation or mismanagement, but is really a dressed up arbitration dispute or a dressed up civil dispute, is referable to arbitration under Section 8. So it is on the basis of that jurisprudence that the case is posited before the NCLT at Mumbai, saying the same jurisprudence will also apply to a dressed up application under Section 8, dressed up application under the Insolvency Code, and that premise comes to be accepted and the application comes to be allowed. Now, before we look at that, I will just point out to Section 8 of the Arbitration Act. Section 8 says a judicial authority before whom an action is brought in a matter which is the subject of an arbitration agreement. So now these are, each one of these words has been interpreted by the courts. A matter, the courts have said, is a dispute, and subsequently Section 8 says that before filing the first statement on the substance of the dispute. So therefore, what Section 8 is effectively saying is, if a dispute has been raised by party A against party B before a judicial authority, and if there is a provision for arbitration, and if that is a matter capable of settlement by arbitration, then that matter, then the court or the tribunal, that is the judicial authority, will exercise no further jurisdiction in that matter and will ask the parties to go seek their remedy before the arbitral tribunal, whether arbitration has been initiated or no. The question that I ask myself is, one, does the decision of the Supreme Court in Sterlite continue to remain good law? That is, will it apply on all fours, as they say, to proceedings under the Insolvency Code? Has the rationale really changed under these two statutes? And two, if it does not apply, how would one take a fresh look at proceedings under the code, since this is an altogether new legislation? Now, the way I look at it, it's a rather crisp decision. I'll call it crisp and really not cryptic. In Sterlite, the Supreme Court makes it very clear that since the destination is not the same, unlike a civil suit, where the destination is a decree, and in an arbitration, once it becomes an award is equal to the decree of a court. So since the destination in both these cases are the same, civil court can very well refer the parties to arbitration. Whereas in the case of winding up, the Supreme Court says that destination is not the same. The winding up proceedings are not proceedings for recovery, and therefore an application for reference to arbitration will not lie. My view is that rationale really hasn't changed with the introduction of the code. All the relevant factors continue to remain the same. These are proceedings in rem, these are not filed for recovery, these are proceedings that will affect the company and all persons associated with the company. And Supreme Court has, in more than one decision, including in Swiss Ribbons, clearly said that these are proceedings in rem. So therefore, that judgment should apply on all fours, and therefore a Section 8 application is to be rejected at the threshold. That is one way of looking at it. Now, if we take a step ahead and say, whether, because the code is a new legislation, one has to look at it with a fresh pair of eyes. Now, if one were to do that, one will have to a certain extent, understand the distinction between the regime that operated under the Companies Act and the regime that operates now under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. The critical words are inability to pay debts in plural. So under the Companies Act, it was not just inability to pay a given debt. It was inability to pay debts on the whole. That was the test. Of course, the Supreme Court said in Madhusudan Govardhan Das and subsequently in 2019 that a willful non-payment of debt is equal to inability. So therefore, inability is actual inability or a willful negligence or a willful default. The regime under the code is quite different. In the previous regime, one had to come before the court and indicate that the company is otherwise its substratum has eroded. That is not the test under the code. The code simply says existence of a dispute, at least in the case of operational creditors, whether a dispute really exists. And the word dispute has been understood, has been held by the Supreme Court in Mobilox. In Mobilox, to mean something which is not a mere bluster, something which is not trivial or not moonshine. The reason I am taking a minute or two on this is that the word dispute also finds mention in section 8 of the Arbitration Act. In my view, when a court when a tribunal is called upon to decide whether the dispute presented before the tribunal is a matter capable of being referred to arbitration, the tribunal will have to come to a conclusion that there is indeed a dispute on facts. The moment the tribunal comes to the conclusion that there is indeed a dispute, the application under the Insolvency Code in itself will not lie, because the test is the lack of a dispute. The moment there is a dispute, there is no application under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So that is one reason to say that application under section 8 of the Arbitration Act has really no place in the scheme of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. The second reason why I say that an application under section 8 of the Arbitration Act will not lie is the legislative intent behind fixing 14 days as the time frame for deciding for taking a decision on whether to admit an application or no. One, reasonably speaking, we all know that 14 days in itself is an extremely short time period. Now, if that is the case, one can hardly expect the tribunal to, within that 14 days, also consider an application under section 8 of the Arbitration Act. Of course, the fact that the time frame is short, which is also now not mandatory but directory, the fact that time period is short is no reason to deny somebody a right if one is otherwise entitled to. I am only saying the time frame is one among the reasons to show that there is no such entitlement. Proceedings under the Insolvency Code at the stage of initiation are extremely summary in nature, not just summary. It is practically a situation where, on looking at the application and the defense presented, the tribunal is able to come to the conclusion that practically no defense. That apart from that, if I may use a phrase, that the defense that is presented is full of rhetoric but has no substance to support it. That is the conclusion that is required before initiating proceedings under the Insolvency Code. Now, if that is really the test, then at that stage, to make an application under section 8 of the Arbitration Act will really serve no practical purpose, because the test is extremely limited, and if that test is passed, then there is really no need to consider an application under section 8. Now let us look at it the other way. An application under the Arbitration Act is nothing but a suit, a civil suit, before a private tribunal chosen by the parties under a somewhat different procedure. Can the pendency of a civil suit in itself or of itself be a defense, complete or otherwise, to an application under the insolvency, to an application for initiation of CIRP. Once again, the jurisprudence that has developed so far is that mere existence of a suit may not be an answer. In fact, this is something that Nakul also touched upon. There is a decision of the Delhi High Court in Resham Singh versus Daewoo Motors, in which, of course, this is going back to winding up times. When in the face of a pending arbitration, the arbitration was set up as a defense to winding up proceedings. And the winding up court says, if I look at the defense taken in the proceedings in question, the defense itself discloses that there is no bona fide dispute. So sometimes one may even be able to bring a written statement filed in a civil suit or a statement of defense filed before an arbitral tribunal to say, for all practical purposes, there is no dispute. See, they have admitted the debt. All I am saying is that the mere existence of a proceedings may not of itself or by itself be a defense. And in any event, the fact that that dispute has not yet been started and that the insolvency application has been filed first will mean that a subsequent suit or a subsequent arbitration is no answer to an insolvency application. Now, if that is true of a civil suit, what is good for the goose is good for the gander. That should also be true for an application to refer the proceedings to arbitration. And now going back to the principal jurisprudential question here, which is, can an application really be made under Section 8 where the destination is not the same? So the only method in which this application can even be made is to call it a dressed up application. So in my understanding, the jurisprudence of dressed up application is possibly available in an action for operation and mismanagement, and that is where the jurisprudence has been borrowed from, because a detailed factual inquiry is contemplated in proceedings under 241, 242, that is operation mismanagement. Affidavits can be filed, oral evidence can also be adduced. So those are proceedings which by their very nature entail a finding on fact. Whereas at the stage of admission, the NCLT does not really make a final conclusion, so to say, on facts. The amount of claim is always to be determined by the resolution professional at a subsequent stage. And if it goes into liquidation, the liquidator ultimately will decide the exact quantum of the claim. What the tribunal is only examining at that stage is whether there is a serious defense available. So keeping that in mind, the fact that a very large factual inquiry is necessary, this doctrine of a dressed up application or a dressed up petition under 397, 398 under the old act, 241, 242 under the new act was evolved so as to prevent applications that are unnecessary under 241, 242. Whereas the IBC being a complete code, the name itself, it's called a code because it's in some sense seeks to be complete in itself, provides sufficient remedies for unscrupulous applications. The code provides for levy of huge penalties in the order of 1 crore of rupees for applications that lack bona fides or that lack merit. So therefore, looked at from all possible legal angles, in my mind, although the NCLT has taken a decision at Mumbai that an application under Section 8 will lie, my understanding is that an application under Section 8 cannot possibly lie in proceedings before the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. The last I'd like to state is, this is called the code. Now, of course, what's in a name is quite well known, but the fact is, this is a statute which amends a number of other statutes. In fact, if I'm not wrong, 10 to 12 statutes are amended under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. it creates an altogether new legal regime for dealing with these issues. So in that sense, this qualifies as a special legislation, and the Arbitration Act really becomes a general legislation, and therefore this special legislation will have the effect of ousting the applicability of a general legislation. So for all these reasons, I believe that if that conflict is set up, which indeed has been by various parties, then uh, very consistent with what Nakul is saying, I believe, one, that there is really no conflict, and if that conflict is set up, it is the provisions of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code which will trump or prevail over the provisions of the Arbitration Act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anu sir, and thank you so much, Nakul sir. It was indeed an insightful session. We now have few questions lined up, so I will take them one by one.
Chahat, before starting with the questions, I just had one aspect, not more than 2 minutes, which I just wanted to share with the audience.
Sure, sir, please.
Small point. And this is that because the topic for the day is that which out of the two, that is the IBC and the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, which out of the two would prevail. And as Manu has in his closing comments rightly said that it is the IBC, I just wanted to give 2 to 3 instances of how the IBC prevails. So let's take a case scenario wherein there is a company against which today there are 10 arbitration awards which have attained finality. From the Supreme Court, 10 arbitration awards attained finality, cumulative amount 10 crores to be paid under those. And another person or a financial creditor takes that company into the IBC tomorrow, initiates a section 7 or a 9, and that 7 or 9 is admitted. Now, eventually, a resolution plan would be filed, or that company goes into liquidation. In the resolution plan, these 10 decree award holders, who are actually decree holders, their debts are extinguished 100% because the liquidation value that could have come to them would be nil. So in this case, despite there being a award, which award under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act has attained finality from the Supreme Court, still no amount will be payable to the award holders, because as per the resolution plan, the amount of the awards have been extinguished. So these are the type of scenarios in which we come to the conclusion that the IBC in actual prevails over the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, because a duly made award under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act can absolutely be made a nullity by virtue of a resolution plan, only because of the fact that that plan is binding on all stakeholders. And an award holder against a corporate debtor would be included in the definition of being a stakeholder, whether he has filed a claim or not even filed a claim. In both scenarios, he would still be a stakeholder and the plan would still be binding on him. So before a company has gone into insolvency, any decision made against him in an arbitration, although attained finality but yet not executed, could well be made a nullity by virtue of operation of the IBC. So this is one of the examples in which actually the IBC prevails over an award made under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Thanks, Chahat. Thank you for those 2 minutes. You can take over now.
Thank you, sir. So we have few questions beforehand, so I'll put forth them one by one. So the first question is section 14 of the IBC applicable to foreign seated arbitrations? Nakul sir, would you like to take this?
Yeah, so section 14 of the IBC, it's actually very widely worded. If we look at it, it talks about any proceedings against the corporate debtor. So it's the institution of suits or continuation of pending suits or proceedings against the corporate debtor, including execution of any judgment, decree or order in any court of law, tribunal, arbitration panel or other authority. Now let me get down to 2 things here, because it's an international arbitration. That's a very good question which has been asked. The first aspect is that whether the International Arbitral Tribunal will consider an order of moratorium passed by an Indian adjudicating authority imposing a moratorium. That is still a question mark because some tribunals would consider it and stall the proceedings while others would not. Now let's take a case. The first position is clear if the proceedings do get stalled. However, if the proceedings don't get stalled and there is eventually an international award against the corporate debtor, which corporate debtor is situated in India, enforcement of that award will still not happen. So eventually the result is the same in terms of 14.1. Even if the proceedings are stalled or not, the enforcement of those proceedings won't happen. And even if the proceedings culminate during the CIRP process, then whatever amount is made payable or due in the award in those proceedings can still be brought to a nullity by virtue of the resolution plan.
May I add one or two sentences here? So I'll take it one step further and say, if the arbitration panel does not accept the order of moratorium, that will possibly be one of the reasons. Of course, at the end, any which ways the award is of no significance if proceedings under the IBC continue. But for non-compliance with a statutory mandate, even for that reason, that award will be vitiated. One. Two, the only way in which one will be able to possibly say that a foreign seated arbitration is not an arbitration within the meaning of section 14 should be to say the foreign seated arbitration does not fall within the meaning of the two words arbitration panel. There is really no other way. And a foreign seated arbitration is recognized as a valid arbitration because the award is enforceable in India under the Arbitration Act. So there is really no way of getting around that. Chahat, are you saying something? We can't hear you.
So am I all right now?
Yes, now.
Sir, can you hear me?
Yes, only this sentence. Can you hear me?
Okay. Sir, moving on to the next question. I'm really sorry, there was some network issue. So, suppose there is settlement between the parties through conciliation. Later on, can the financial creditor go for IBC regarding the same debt?
Yes. So long as there is an agreement that the law can recognize, that is, at the end of conciliation, there will possibly be an agreement where rights and liabilities are written down. And if that obligation is not performed, failure to perform that obligation can become the basis for a second set of proceedings or the first set of proceedings.
Thank you, sir. Nakul, sir, would you like to add something?
Yeah, Chahat, with regard to this, I would just want to take it a little forward from what Manu said. So if there is a conciliation award, then as per the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, that award is also equally enforceable, like an award made in arbitration, and eventually like a decree of a court. Going forward, so a conciliation award will amount to a debt due. No dispute on that aspect under the IBC. And for a debt due, a party can go even in a 7 and for a 9, because 9 there will be no dispute and the prerequisite under 7 is only debt due. But whether that party qualifies within the parameters of being a financial creditor or an operational creditor will be seen afresh by the NCLT, by the adjudicating authority. So the first parameter or essential ingredient under 7 or 9, 7 being a financial creditor, 9 being an operational creditor, that will have to be looked at, from a fresh angle by the NCLT. The second prerequisite will be met in both cases, because in the first case there will be a debt due, and in the second case there will not be a default. There will not be a dispute. So, but the first question the NCLT will have to look at afresh, whether the person falls within the definition of a financial creditor or an operational creditor, as the case may be.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. So next question is, if there is a petition before NCLT by a financial creditor involving disputed claim, where the default is not clear on the face of it, can that be admitted under Section 7 of the IBC? Nakul sir, would you like to answer that?
So, Chahat, like I said, the ingredients to satisfy in a Section 7 are actually quite mechanical. Manu even emphasized that the ingredients under Section 9 are also quite mechanical, to suggest that, you know, proceedings under the IBC are not summary, but absolutely and extremely summary in nature. So the ingredients are very simple. And for a Section 7 petition, 1, you have to be a financial creditor. 2, that there has to be a default. To see if there has been a default, you have to see whether there was a debt. And to see whether there was a debt, you have to see whether there ever was a claim. If these 3 essentials are met, then the 7 will be admitted. If they are not met, then the 7 will not be admitted. But let me be clear that hyper-technical averments of facts or disputed questions will not be decided by the NCLT. It's either there is a debt due or not due. The NCLT, as we call it, the adjudicating authority, is not a fact-finding court. It is a tribunal under a specific code, empowered under a specific code to decide a certain issue. And that issue is not actually a fact-finding sort of an inquiry in which evidence needs to be led. It is very simple and non-technical. So if it goes through the thread of the essential requirements under Section 7, it will be admitted, otherwise it will not. And this will vary from case to case, but there will be very slim chances to assert that there is no debt due.
Okay, thank you, Nakul sir. Manu sir, would you like to share your thoughts on this?
Just one addition, that at times there could genuinely be disputes, but from what I have seen in most of these cases, those disputes are relatable to a certain portion of the debt. So therefore, I understand this question comes from a very practical perspective. So the practical answer remains the same, that very, very slim chances of a dispute being considered and therefore an application being not entertained, because from what I have seen, there are disputes about interest, about overcharging, about compound interest and things like that. But so long as the principal remains due and there's no dispute and the threshold prescribed under the code is met, the application will go through. That the quantification, there is some kind of dispute, will not remain a question unless the dispute is of such a magnitude that it will not even meet the threshold, which is rarely the case.
Thank you so much, sir. Moving on to the next question. During the pandemic, as we know, provisions of IBC have been suspended for some time in order to provide a relief to the borrowers. While a substantial growth in NPAs is estimated during this fiscal, what should be the middle path that can be the way forward in order to mitigate most of the losses, if not all? Manu sir, would you like to take this one?
Yes. So let me take a step back and refer to the objective of enactment of the code. This is something that the Supreme Court has also referred to. The Supreme Court has referred to the banking committee, to the speech made by the then minister. which is to say, when a company is not doing well, the control of the company should go from the existing shareholder, because his money is equity money, to the lenders or to other operational creditors, so that they can then decide the fate of the entity. So my view is that a middle path which has been provided is possibly large enough already, and that going forward, that is more than a year's moratorium cannot simply be considered, because we will then convert the code into proceedings such as SICA, which we have consciously now repealed and moved on from. Now, having said that, the other way of looking at a moratorium or a middle path of sorts would be to possibly increase the threshold to a significantly large number, to exclude MSMEs altogether or for a specific time frame. Therefore, to ensure that the spillover effect on the economy as a whole is limited. That is, keep smaller claims outside the ambit of NCLT, but proceed with the larger claims. Keep certain kinds of entities out of the ambit of the insolvency code for a longer duration. These could be the means. But as I have said earlier, in times of loss, it is not the bank which has to take the hit. When there is profit, the shareholder earns the money. When there is loss, the shareholder should also suffer the consequences. That is the code.
Thank you, sir. Nakul sir, would you like to add something on this?
I would just like to add one point to that, which is that, you see, when we try and understand the code, what comes to my mind actually is that it is nothing but a cure to a disease. When a person, for example, is infected with cancer or he develops cancer in his body, he actually has to give up his body for a certain amount of treatment, and either after the treatment he comes out of that disease and is able to live a normal life, or he passes away. It's very simple. When a company cannot continue with its obligations in a certain manner, it needs to go through a process, and at the other end of the process, either it will come out with a revitalized life, or it will come out, as we say, liquidation, which is death of a corporate entity. Now, if we look at the amendment that has been brought about, the amendment is for a debt which arises post the amendment. So any NPAs which had been done prior to bringing in the amendment will still stand today. I mean, people can still file petitions on those bases. Any operational debts which had been crystallized prior to the bringing in of the amendment would also be, those operational creditors would be entitled to file petitions today. The only cooling off period has been given from the date on which the amendment has been brought about to a certain future date. My only observation is that, you can, like a moratorium is to give breathing space to a ailing company. In the same way, because there's been a pandemic, you can give that, it's a moratorium type of an effect, which is an overall moratorium from the insolvency code itself for any debt which is accrued during the pandemic. But section 10 should be left out of this ambit, because if there is a company which itself realizes today that, I cannot overcome this without going for treatment, without going through CIRP, I can't overcome the pandemic, to stall that company from availing that option for the next 1 year, in which that company will be absolutely dead. Today, that company might be able to garner some value by going into insolvency under the code. But 1 year down the line, that company won't be able to garner any value. So my first suggestion would be that if section 10 could have been left out of the ambit. Now, we look at it from this one angle. There is a counter angle to this also, that why the amendment has been brought in And one of the aspects which may have sort of touched the legislature's mind would have been that there is a liquidity crunch in view of the pandemic. So if there is no pandemic, there are chances of better resolutions happening. If during a pandemic companies go into the CIRP and there is a strict timeline within which the CIRP is to be concluded, people may not want to spend that much of money in filing a resolution plan and taking a company under the IBC. So that may defeat the purpose of the IBC. This must have been one of the weighing factors which must have weighed with the legislature while coming up with this moratorium from the IBC.
Thank you so much, sir. So we have many questions lined up, but due to time constraint, we plan to take last two questions. I hope that is fine with our speakers.
Absolutely fine.
Okay, sir. So the next question is, if the agreement contains the arbitration clause when the dispute qualifies for insolvency proceedings as well, is it compulsory that the dispute must be referred to the arbitration? And if it is not, then which one is better for effective solution?
So answering the question in the order, one, that the agreement contains an arbitration clause may not be a relevant factor in deciding whether to initiate an application for insolvency. Two, if you ask me which is better, one will really have to analyze what one wants. If the goal or purpose is recovery of dues or performance of the contract, as the case may be, then arbitration would of course be the preferred remedy. But if one comes to a genuine conclusion that this is an entity which may not survive for too long, so therefore it is not that this entity has raised the dispute because there is a genuine dispute, but that this entity is unable to perform the contract or pay its debts, as the case may be, and therefore is raising a dispute, then there is no point wasting good money over bad. No point spending time in pursuing an arbitration, getting an award which is enforceable, but the entity does not remain. So who does one enforce such an award against? So therefore, in those circumstances, one is better off initiating proceedings under the code. But it is no bar in any sense of the term, until and unless the entity against whom the application is filed comes and sets up the arbitration clause by filing an application requesting for reference of the dispute. That's when that application will have to be opposed.
Nakul sir, would you like to add something on this?
I totally agree with Manu's view on that. You see, as a matter of jurisprudence, we need to see what is the remedy that you actually want. What is the wrong that has been caused to you, to which you need a cure. It is simply, if it is a money dispute and you want recovery, your mechanism is to file a suit for recovery, and as an alternative to a suit, if your document contains an arbitration clause, then initiate an arbitration. But if you're of a holistic view that you see, even after an arbitration, I may not get anything from this party, or this party does not even have the solvency to furnish my amount after an arbitration, then you may consider directly going in for an insolvency proceedings, and not otherwise. You know, the legislature has made the agenda absolutely clear that arbitration exists for dispute resolution. Insolvency is not dispute resolution. It is, for some odd reason, we still try and, it's just to use IBC as a pressure tactic. So, let's file an IBC petition, and arbitration will go on for 10 years. In an IBC, if they have to make the payment, they'll make the payment in a month, 2 months, 6 months maximum. But that is not the agenda. This was never the agenda. The agenda is that both of these acts actually operate in different spheres. And you need to see that which is what is your cause, and then choose and remedy according to your cause.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. So to the last question, to sum it up, How can we have harmonious construction between both the codes without overlapping of some concept? Nakul sir, would you like to?
Yeah. So you see, I had actually said it in my part of the discussion, and Manu also agrees with the fact we actually don't feel that there are too many areas in which there is an overlap. There is not a lot of conflict between the two laws because the path of both the laws lead to to different destinations. In fact, they don't lead to the same destination. If there are two laws which are passed which take you to the same destination, then those two paths, there is a chance, may overlap. Here the two destinations are actually diametrically opposite, like what I was speaking in reply to my last question. So because the destination is diametrically opposite, the paths are diametrically opposite, or at max they run next to each other parallelly. In most scenarios, they don't overlap. If so, because the paths don't overlap, there are very few chances of there being a conflict. But if ever there is a conflict, like what we had earlier mentioned, that although you have an award in your favor, but because of a plan, that amount can be totally extinguished. In those type of scenarios, the Arbitration and Conciliation Act will have to hold back because of what Manu had earlier said, because the IBC is a special statute. That right is specifically given under the IBC by virtue of Section 238. And in terms of Section 238, the supremacy of the IBC is not only qua the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, it's qua most of the other acts which are prevalent in the country, which includes, say, something like the Income Tax Act. So the government exchequer, to give supremacy to the insolvency process, is ready to take a hit on themselves. So it just gives an indication that, you see, the government or the state itself takes a back seat for its own claims when it comes to the IBC. That is how much precedence the IBC is given to. And arbitration may also include a government claim, it may include a private party claim, but any act which is inconsistent with the IBC prevails over that act. But that is only in a case where there is conflict. With regard to the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, in my view, at most juncture, there won't be a conflict.
So
Thank you, sir.
if I can add a short point, like Nakul said, these statutes don't interact, and where they do interact, I think it would be best if the provisions of the Arbitration Act give way to the provisions of the code, because the Supreme Court has now, in Swiss Ribbon, if I'm not wrong, in the last paragraph said that not only is the Parliament entitled to make trial and error in economic legislations, but that this experiment seems to have turned out fairly all right. So there is, in some sense, a word of appreciation by the Supreme Court that this experiment has turned out all right. So therefore, if one looks at the regime that existed in the past, the SICA, the winding up, it was a never-ending process. Now, with one fell swoop, the slate has been cleaned. So therefore, we do well as a country, and we do well as a country really if we keep arbitration and all associated proceedings out and permit them only insofar as they are permitted under the code. That will subserve the object with which the code is enacted and will not in any way undo what the Arbitration Act intends to do. The paths don't cross, and where they do, I think the code should prevail, which already it is.
Thank you so much, sir. We seem to have covered all the questions. Thank you so much, Nakul sir, and thank you so much, Manu sir. It was quite an insightful and an informative session. Again, it was a privilege to have you both here today. I would also like to thank all the participants for being a part of today's Legit class. For recording of today's Legit class, you can subscribe to our Legit Quest channel. Thank you so much, sir. Good evening,
Thank you.
sir.
Thank you, everybody.
And thank you to Legit Class for this wonderful opportunity of interacting with the audience and amongst ourselves as well. We're really fortunate to have done this, and best of luck to everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
so
you.
much.